I suggest you remember your place, Mr. Thornton." The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable designed to wound, to diminish, to remind everyone present of an unspoken hierarchy. Judge Howard Blackwell leaned forward from his elevated bench, his silver hair catching the light, his tone dripping with contempt as he stared down at the young black attorney standing alone before him. Blood rushed in Curtis Thornton's ears. The watching jury, the smirking prosecutor, the frightened client whose life hung in the balance, all faded away as Curtis felt the familiar sting of being deemed unworthy, unwelcome, a sensation he had spent a lifetime fighting, only to have it laid bare in this marble temple of supposed justice. "Your Honor," Curtis began, his voice steadier than the trembling in his chest would suggest, "the law doesn't recognize places. Only facts, evidence, and truth." A collective gasp rippled through Courtroom 305. No one spoke to Judge Blackwell that way, especially not a public defender barely 3 years out of law school. The court reporter's fingers froze over her stenography machine. The bailiff stiffened, as if preparing for an explosion. Judge Blackwell's face darkened to a dangerous crimson, his gavel hand twitching with barely restrained fury. Curtis stood perfectly still, his expression a practiced mask of professional calm despite the heat rising in his chest. "Your Honor, the defense has followed Rule 803 precisely in our submission of—" "I'm not finished, Mr. Thornton." The judge's interruption was swift and cutting. "When I want the opinion of a first-year associate who clearly wandered into the wrong courtroom, I'll ask for it." A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the gallery. Assistant District Attorney Pearson tried to hide a smirk behind her hand. Several jurors shifted awkwardly in their seats. Curtis felt every pair of eyes in the room. The bailiff, the court reporter, the observers in the back rows, all watching to see if the young black attorney would crumble under the judge's scorn. But behind Curtis's calm exterior burned a fire that had been kindled long ago, in a childhood where he had witnessed firsthand how the scales of justice could be catastrophically unbalanced. His hands remained steady as he replied, "With all due respect, Your Honor, I've properly filed all required documentation according to the rules of this court. If there's a specific issue with the defense's evidence submission, I'd appreciate the court's guidance rather than its contempt." Judge Blackwell's eyebrows shot up, his face reddening slightly at the composed pushback. "You'll watch your tone in my courtroom, Mr. Thornton. One more remark like that, and I'll hold you in contempt. Now, approach the bench." As Curtis walked forward, back straight and stride purposeful, he could feel the tension vibrating through the courtroom. He knew what everyone was thinking, that this would be the last time Curtis Thornton appeared before Judge Blackwell, or perhaps any judge in the district. His career might end before it had truly begun. But they didn't know Curtis Thornton. They didn't know where he came from or what it had taken for him to stand in this courtroom today. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below with your city or country. It's amazing to see our community tuning in from all over the world. All right, back to our story. Curtis hadn't been born into the law. Growing up in Ridgewood Heights, a neighborhood where police sirens served as nightly lullabies, he'd been raised by his grandmother after losing his parents in a car accident when he was just 7. Their small apartment above Ms. Gladys's beauty salon was modest but immaculate, filled with the scent of lemon polish and the sound of his grandmother's favorite gospel records. "Education is your liberation," Grandma May would tell him every morning before school, her arthritic hands smoothing his collar with tender precision. "They can take your possessions, they can even take your freedom, but they can never take what you know." Curtis had taken those words to heart, staying up late reading borrowed books by lamplight while other kids played outside. The neighborhood called him Professor long before he'd earned any degree, a nickname that was sometimes spoken with admiration, sometimes with mockery. But Curtis didn't mind. He had his eyes fixed on something beyond the cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences of Ridgewood Heights. His path became crystal clear on a sweltering summer evening when he was 15. He had been walking home from his part-time job at the local library when he witnessed his cousin Xavier being slammed against a police car, wrongfully accused of a convenience store robbery that had happened across town. Curtis had stood helplessly on the sidewalk, watching as Xavier tried to explain he'd been at work all day, his words falling on deaf ears. Later, at the precinct where Grandma May had taken him to wait for news, a tired-looking public defender had appeared briefly, spending less than 5 minutes with Xavier before recommending he take a plea deal for a crime he hadn't committed. "It's the best we can do," the attorney had said with a shrug that still haunted Curtis's dreams. Xavier had taken the deal, resulting in 18 months of incarceration that derailed his college scholarship and altered the trajectory of his life. And Curtis had made a vow that night. No one should face the system alone and unprepared. Not if he could help it. That vow had carried him through college on a patchwork of scholarships and part-time jobs, through the sleepless nights of law school, where he was one of only 7 black students in his class, through the skeptical glances when he'd turned down lucrative corporate offers to work in public defense. And now that vow had brought him here, to Courtroom 305, facing down Judge Howard Blackwell, a man whose reputation for harsh sentences and antiquated views preceded him like a storm cloud. At the bench, Judge Blackwell's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow cut deeper than his public admonishment. "Mr. Thornton, I've seen your type before. Eager young attorneys who think they can change the system overnight, who memorize a few statutes and believe that makes them Perry Mason." He leaned forward slightly. "This is my courtroom. I've been dispensing justice here since before you were born. If you can't abide by my standards, perhaps you should reconsider your career choice." Curtis met the judge's gaze directly. "I appreciate your many years of service, Your Honor. I'm simply trying to provide my client with the zealous representation he deserves under the Constitution." For a flickering moment, something like respect, or perhaps surprise, crossed Judge Blackwell's face before his expression hardened again. "Return to your table, counselor. We'll continue, but consider this your only warning." As Curtis walked back, he caught the eye of Loretta Washington, the veteran court reporter whose fingers had never paused on her stenography machine during the exchange. Unlike the other court staff who avoided eye contact, Loretta gave Curtis the faintest of nods, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. But in that tiny gesture, Curtis sensed something unexpected: alliance. Back at the defense table, Curtis's client, DeAndre Lewis, leaned over. "Man, that judge hates you," he whispered, anxiety etching lines around his young eyes. "We're done for." "No, we're not," Curtis replied quietly, organizing his notes with steady hands. "We've just begun." DeAndre Lewis's case should have been straightforward. A 22-year-old community college student with no prior record, DeAndre had been charged with armed robbery based on a vague witness description and circumstantial evidence. The security camera footage was grainy at best, and the prosecution's timeline had glaring inconsistencies. But what should have been a routine dismissal for lack of evidence had transformed into a high-stakes battle the moment it landed in Judge Blackwell's courtroom. Curtis had taken the case despite warnings from colleagues at the public defender's office. Blackwell's courtroom is where defense cases go to die, his supervisor had cautioned. But something about DeAndre's quiet dignity and unwavering claim of innocence had resonated with Curtis. Here was another Xavier, another young black man whose future hung in the balance of a system designed to process rather than protect him. As the prosecution called their first witness, Curtis focused his attention completely. This case wasn't just about DeAndre anymore. It had become something larger, a test of whether dedication and truth could prevail against prejudice and power. Whether Curtis Thornton belonged in this courtroom at all. The afternoon proceeded with the prosecution building their flimsy case, and Curtis noting every inconsistency, every procedural error he could challenge. Each time he rose to object, Judge Blackwell regarded him with thinly veiled annoyance, but Curtis remained undeterred. During a brief recess, as Curtis reviewed his notes at the defense table, a courthouse janitor approached to empty the nearby trash can. "You're doing good, young blood," the older man whispered without looking at him. "Don't let the old guard smoke you out. We need you here." Before Curtis could respond, the man had moved on, his encouragement hanging in the air like invisible armor. Curtis straightened his shoulders. He wasn't alone in this fight. even if most of his allies remained in the shadows, watching and hoping. When court resumed, the prosecution called their star witness, the convenience store clerk who claimed to have seen the robber's face. As the questioning began, Curtis noticed something. Whenever Judge Blackwell thought no one was watching, his gaze drifted to the large antique clock on the courtroom wall. The judge was rushing through the afternoon's proceedings, steering the prosecutor to hurry along with subtle gestures and impatient nods. Curtis made a split-second decision. When his time for cross-examination came, he would slow everything down. Methodically, deliberately, force the court to confront every inconsistency in the witness's story. "Your witness, Mr. Thornton," Judge Blackwell finally announced, a note of resignation in his voice. "Please be brief. The court's time is valuable." Curtis stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll take exactly the time my client's future deserves." For the next 45 minutes, Curtis led the witness through a careful deconstruction of his testimony, revealing contradictions the prosecution had glossed over. With each question, he could feel Judge Blackwell's impatience growing, but the judge couldn't interject without appearing to obstruct legitimate defense questioning. By the time Curtis finished his cross-examination, the witness's credibility had been severely damaged, and the gallery was watching with renewed interest. Even some of the jurors were looking at Curtis with something approaching respect. "Redirect, Ms. Pearson?" Judge Blackwell asked, clearly hoping to repair the damage. The prosecutor stood, looking flustered. "No further questions, Your Honor." "Very well. This court will adjourn until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp." Judge Blackwell's gavel came down with unnecessary force. As people began to file out, he added, "Mr. Thornton, a word in my chambers." Curtis felt a moment of apprehension. A private dressing down in the judge's chambers could be far worse than the public humiliation earlier. But he nodded calmly. "Of course, Your Honor." As the courtroom emptied, Curtis gathered his materials, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He had followed every rule of procedure, even if he had stretched the judge's patience. There were no grounds for any formal complaint against him. When he stood to leave, he noticed Loretta Washington, the court reporter, lingering at her station, organizing her equipment with deliberate slowness. "First time before Blackwell?" she asked quietly when no one else was within earshot. "Yes," Curtis replied. "He likes to intimidate new attorneys in his chambers, especially ones who," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "don't fit his image of what a lawyer should be." Curtis understood her meaning perfectly. "He'll tell you that you embarrassed him in his courtroom," Loretta continued, her hands still busy with her equipment. "That you should think about whether you belong here." "And what should I say to that?" Curtis asked. Loretta finally looked up, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time. Judge Blackwell clerked for Justice Hammond on the Supreme Court back in '85. He brings it up whenever he feels challenged. It's his way of establishing authority. Just something to know. She gave a small, meaningful smile. "Good luck, counselor." With that cryptic advice, she picked up her stenography machine and walked away, leaving Curtis to wonder how this information might help him survive the coming confrontation. The walk to Judge Blackwell's chambers felt like crossing a battlefield. Curtis straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. "Enter," came the curt response from within. Curtis stepped into the wood-paneled office where Judge Blackwell sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, his black robe still on, his expression thunderous. "Close the door, Mr. Thornton." Curtis did as instructed, then stood quietly, waiting. "Do you have any idea what you did in my courtroom today?" the judge asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Curtis remained silent, sensing it was a rhetorical question. "You turned a straightforward cross-examination into a spectacle," Judge Blackwell continued. "You undermined the prosecution's case not based on facts, but on performance." Curtis couldn't let that stand. "With respect, Your Honor, every question I asked was directly relevant to establishing the unreliability of the witness's identification of my client. That's not performance. That's my duty as defense counsel." "Your duty?" Judge Blackwell's laugh was short and bitter. "Let me tell you about duty, young man. I've served on this bench for 26 years. Before that, I clerked for Justice Hammond on the United States Supreme Court. I've seen attorneys come and go, brilliant ones, mediocre ones, and everything in between. His eyes narrowed. You have raw talent, I'll grant you that. But talent without respect for the institution, for the procedures that make our legal system function, that's not just useless, it's dangerous. Curtis absorbed the criticism, reminded of Loretta's words. The judge was indeed leaning on his Supreme Court connection, just as she'd predicted. Judge Blackwell, Curtis said carefully, I have the utmost respect for this court and for your experience. But my primary obligation is to my client, who faces years in prison for a crime that the evidence simply doesn't support. I can't apologize for defending him vigorously within the bounds of the law. The judge's face reddened slightly. You think what you're doing is noble, don't you? The crusading public defender, fighting for justice. He leaned forward. Let me give you some free advice, Mr. Thornton. This idealism of yours, it won't last. The system is bigger than you, bigger than any individual. You'll either learn to work within it, or you'll burn out trying to change it. Curtis felt a flash of anger, but kept his expression neutral. Perhaps, Your Honor. But until that happens, I intend to give every client the defense they deserve, including DeAndre Lewis. Judge Blackwell studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. Don't be late, and don't expect any special accommodations for your theatrical approach to defense law. I'll be on time, Your Honor. And fully prepared, Curtis replied evenly. Dismissed, the judge said with a wave of his hand, already turning his attention to papers on his desk. As Curtis walked out of the chambers, his heart was pounding, but his resolve had only strengthened. Tomorrow would be another battle, but now he knew the terrain a little better. Judge Blackwell might hold the power in that courtroom, but Curtis had something perhaps even more potent, the burning conviction that justice could prevail, even in the most hostile territory. The real test would come in the morning, when Curtis would have to present his defense case. As he stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight, he pulled out his phone to call his grandmother. If anyone would understand the weight of this moment, it would be Grandma May, whose quiet strength had carried him this far. Hey, Grandma, he said when she answered. You got time to talk? It's been quite a day. The following morning, Curtis arrived at the courthouse an hour early, the weight of his briefcase matched only by the weight of responsibility he carried. The marble halls were nearly empty, his footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceilings as he made his way to a quiet alcove to review his notes one final time. You're here bright and early, counselor. Curtis looked up to find Loretta Washington approaching, a cardboard tray with 2 coffee cups in her hands. She offered one to him. Black, 2 sugars. I noticed things, it's part of the job, she explained as Curtis accepted the coffee with surprise. 23 years recording every word in that courtroom. You learn to read people. And you look like you could use this. Thank you, Curtis said, genuinely touched by the small kindness. Does Judge Blackwell always come down so hard on new attorneys? Or is it just me? Loretta's eyes darted around to ensure they were alone. Blackwell has a reputation, as I'm sure you've heard. But with you, she hesitated. Let's just say some judges have certain expectations about who belongs in their courtroom. And when someone challenges those expectations just by showing up and doing their job well, she shrugged meaningfully. Curtis nodded, understanding perfectly what she wasn't saying explicitly. It wasn't just that he was new or inexperienced. It was the color of his skin in a system where black faces were far more common in the defendant's chair than at the attorney's table. Judge Blackwell graduated from Harrison Law in '78. Loretta continued, her voice low. He's from a different era. His father was a judge too, and his grandfather before that. He believes in a certain order to things. And I'm disrupting that order, Curtis concluded. By existing. By being good at what you do, Loretta confirmed. But I've seen attorneys come and go over the decades, and I'll tell you this, talent and preparation always show, even when some people don't want to see it. She glanced at her watch. I should get to the courtroom. Good luck today, Mr. Thornton. As she walked away, Curtis called after her softly. Why are you helping me? Loretta paused, but didn't turn around. My son just finished his first year of law school, she said simply, then continued down the hall. The interaction left Curtis feeling strangely heartened. He took a sip of the perfectly prepared coffee and returned to his notes with renewed focus. Today, he would need to be flawless. Courtroom 305 filled quickly that morning. Word had apparently spread about the young public defender who had stood his ground against Judge Blackwell, and the gallery seats were occupied by a mix of law students, courthouse staff on their breaks, and curious observers. Curtis noticed a few other public defenders had slipped in as well, perhaps to witness his professional demise, or maybe to offer silent solidarity. When Judge Blackwell entered, his eyes swept over the unusual crowd with obvious displeasure before landing on Curtis. "I see we've become quite the attraction, Mr. Thornton," he remarked dryly as proceedings began. "The public has a right to observe our justice system at work, Your Honor," Curtis replied evenly. The morning began with the prosecution calling their final witnesses, a police detective whose testimony was polished from years of courtroom experience, and a forensic technician who presented evidence linking the robbery to DeAndre's neighborhood, if not to DeAndre himself. Curtis cross-examined both methodically, respectfully, but persistently. He noticed that Judge Blackwell seemed determined to interrupt his questioning at every opportunity. "Move along, counselor. This line of questioning is redundant. The court reminds you to be concise, Mr. Thornton. Is there a point to these questions, or are you simply hoping to stumble upon one?" Each interruption was designed to throw Curtis off balance, to make him appear unprepared or incompetent before the jury. But Curtis remained unflappable, adapting his approach and maintaining his composure with a discipline forged through years of navigating spaces that weren't designed to welcome him. During a brief recess before the defense would present its case, ADA Pearson approached Curtis at the water fountain. "Blackwell's really got it in for you," she observed, filling her paper cup. "Nothing personal. I've been where you are, trying to make a name for myself, taking on impossible cases." She lowered her voice. "Look, we both know your client doesn't have priors. The DA's office would entertain a plea to a lesser charge, simple robbery, 3 years, possibility of parole in 18 months. Curtis studied her, recognizing the offering for what it was, not compassion, but convenience. "My client is innocent, Miss Pearson, but thank you for the offer." She raised an eyebrow. "Innocence is a luxury in this system, Thornton. You're doing DeAndre no favors by setting him up for a maximum sentence when he could walk in less than 2 years. Curtis watched her return to the prosecution table, her words settling uncomfortably in his mind. Was he risking his client's future to prove a point? To challenge a judge who'd already decided against them? Doubt crept in for the first time since he'd taken the case. As Curtis prepared to present his defense, Judge Blackwell called him to the bench. The prosecutor joined them, and the judge activated the white noise machine that would prevent the jury and gallery from overhearing their conversation. "Mr. Thornton, I understand you've rejected the Commonwealth's generous plea offer," Judge Blackwell said, his tone conversational but his eyes hard. "That's a significant gamble with your client's future." "My client maintains his innocence, Your Honor. We're prepared to present our case." "I see." The judge leaned forward slightly. "You should know that if the jury convicts, and statistics suggest they likely will, I will not look favorably upon a defendant who refused a reasonable offer only to waste the court's time." Curtis felt his pulse quicken at the thinly veiled threat. "Are you suggesting that you would impose a harsher sentence if my client exercises his constitutional right to trial, Your Honor?" The judge's expression darkened. "I'm suggesting that actions have consequences, counselor. And inexperienced attorneys who mistake stubbornness for advocacy often learn that lesson the hard way, unfortunately at their client's expense." Curtis glanced over at DeAndre, who was watching the bench conference with visible anxiety. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Curtis's shoulders like a physical force. If he failed, DeAndre would pay the price, potentially with years of his life. "We'll proceed with our defense, Your Honor," Curtis said finally, his decision made. "Very well." Judge Blackwell dismissed them with a wave. "But don't say you weren't warned." As Curtis walked back to the defense table, A memory surfaced unbidden, a moment from his past that had helped shape the man he'd become. Curtis had been 19, a sophomore on academic scholarship at Monroe University, when he'd encountered Professor Eleanor Hargrove. Her constitutional law course was legendary for its rigor, and she was known for her exacting standards and unforgiving assessments. On the first day of class, she'd surveyed the lecture hall with a practiced eye, her gaze pausing briefly on Curtis, one of only 3 black students in a room of 70. "Mr. Thornton," she'd called, though she hadn't taken attendance yet. "Tell me, if you would, why Brown versus Board of Education represents both the greatest achievement and the greatest failure of American constitutional law." Curtis had frozen momentarily, startled at being singled out for such a complex question without warning. The silence in the room had been deafening as all eyes turned to him. "I'm waiting, Mr. Thornton," Professor Hargrove had prompted, her expression impassive. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to withdraw from this course now if you're not prepared to contribute." In that moment, Curtis had recognized the test for what it was, not just of his knowledge, but of his resilience. He'd straightened in his seat and met her gaze directly. "Brown represents our highest achievement because it acknowledged that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, affirming that the law should protect the rights of all citizens equally," he'd begun. "But it's also our greatest failure because the court lacked the courage to order immediate implementation, instead using the phrase, 'with all deliberate speed,' which became an excuse for decades of resistance and delay. The case shows both the law's power to articulate moral principles and its limitation when those principles face deeply entrenched opposition." Professor Hargrove's expression hadn't changed, but something in her eyes had shifted. Not entirely without merit, had been her only response before moving on to her lecture. Later in the semester, after Curtis had earned the highest grade on their midterm examination, she'd called him to her office. "You know why I called on you that first day, don't you?" she'd asked without preamble. "Because you expected me to fail," Curtis had answered honestly. "No," she'd corrected him. "Because I needed to know if you would allow others' expectations to define your performance. In this profession, Mr. Thornton, you will constantly face people who expect less of you. Judges, opposing counsel, even clients. The question is whether you'll rise to defy those expectations or use them as an excuse." She'd fixed him with an appraising look. "The law is not fair, Mr. Thornton. The courtroom is not a level playing field. This is the reality you will face if you pursue this path. But those who succeed are those who prepare more thoroughly, think more clearly, and refuse to be intimidated, even when the odds are stacked against them." Curtis had carried those words with him through the rest of college, through law school, and into his career. They returned to him now, standing in Judge Blackwell's courtroom, facing long odds and harsh judgment. "DeAndre," Curtis said quietly to his client as court prepared to resume, "I need to know one more time. The truth. Were you involved in this robbery in any way?" DeAndre met his eyes steadily. "No, sir. I was at the library studying for my accounting final. I swear on my mother's life." Curtis nodded once. "Then we fight, no matter what that judge throws at us." When court reconvened, Curtis began presenting the defense case. His first witness was the librarian who confirmed DeAndre's presence during the time of the robbery. His second was a digital forensics expert who testified that the quality of the security camera footage was too poor for reliable identification. Throughout each examination, Judge Blackwell interrupted with skeptical questions and dismissive comments. His bias was becoming increasingly apparent, not just to Curtis, but to everyone in the courtroom. Several jurors were exchanging glances when the judge made particularly unfair remarks. After the lunch recess, Curtis was preparing to call his final witness when Judge Blackwell delivered his most devastating blow yet. "Mr. Thornton, the court has been reviewing your evidentiary submissions and finds that your expert witness report was filed improperly. As such, the jury will disregard the testimony of your digital forensics expert." Curtis felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath him. "Your Honor, the defense filed that report according to the same procedures accepted by this court in State v. Williams just last month." Are you suggesting I don't know the procedures of my own courtroom, counselor? Judge Blackwell's voice was deadly quiet. No, Your Honor. I'm stating for the record that the defense followed proper procedure, and I would request the court's specific citation for the alleged improper filing. The courtroom went completely silent. Curtis was directly challenging the judge's ruling, a risky move that could provoke serious consequences. Judge Blackwell's face darkened with anger. We'll discuss this matter in chambers. Now, he turned to the jury. This court will recess for 30 minutes. As Curtis followed the judge toward his chambers, he caught Loretta's eye. She gave him the smallest nod of approval, but her expression was concerned. In the gallery, he noticed several young black law students watching intently, their faces reflecting both admiration and worry. In chambers, Judge Blackwell didn't bother with preamble. You've just committed professional suicide, Mr. Thornton. Challenging my ruling in open court crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. With respect, Your Honor, excluding critical exculpatory evidence on procedural grounds that don't actually exist would be reversible error, Curtis replied, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. I'm not challenging your authority. I'm fulfilling my ethical obligation to my client. Ethics? Judge Blackwell scoffed. Let me tell you about ethics, young man. I've devoted my life to upholding the law. I've sentenced murderers and exonerated the innocent. I've made decisions that have shaped legal precedent in this commonwealth. And I will not be lectured on ethics by a public defender barely out of law school who thinks he knows better than this court. Curtis took a deep breath. Judge Blackwell, I don't claim to know better than you, but I do know that my client deserves a fair trial. The rules of evidence are clear, and my filing was proper. If there's a specific procedural issue, I'm happy to address it, but there needs to be a basis in law. Something in Curtis's calm persistence seemed to catch the judge off guard. He studied Curtis for a long moment before speaking again. You remind me of someone, Thornton, a young attorney I encountered during my time clerking for Justice Hammond. Brilliant legal mind, refused to back down even when every institutional force was aligned against him. The judge's expression was unreadable. His career ended before it began because he couldn't learn when to fight and when to concede. What happened to him? Curtis asked, genuinely curious. He left law altogether. Last I heard, he was teaching high school somewhere in Ohio. Judge Blackwell turned to look out his window. A waste of potential. Curtis recognized the story for what it was, a warning, perhaps even one offered with a twisted form of concern. But he wouldn't, back down. Your Honor, I understand what you're telling me, but this isn't about my career. It's about DeAndre Lewis, who's facing 15 years for a crime he didn't commit. Whatever consequences come my way, I can accept them. But I can't accept failing my client because I was too intimidated to advocate properly. Judge Blackwell turned back, surprising Curtis with what almost looked like reluctant respect in his eyes. You've made your position clear, counselor. We'll return to court, and I will review the filing procedures more carefully. If indeed they match those accepted in State v. Williams, the testimony will stand. Curtis hardly dared to believe what he was hearing. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Thornton. You've won a minor skirmish, not the war. And challenging a judge, even when you're right, especially when you're right, has a way of following an attorney. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Blackwell announced that after review, the expert testimony would be allowed. Curtis caught Loretta smiling slightly as her fingers flew over her stenography machine. The defense case proceeded, and by late afternoon, both sides had presented their closing arguments. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Curtis felt emotionally drained but quietly confident. He had done everything possible for DeAndre. Now it was in the jury's hands. Judge Blackwell adjourned court until the jury reached a verdict. As people began to file out, Curtis was surprised when Loretta approached him. Whatever happens with the verdict, you should be proud, she said quietly. Not many attorneys would have stood their ground like that. I appreciate your help, Curtis replied. That tip about State v. Williams was crucial. Loretta smiled enigmatically. I don't know what you're talking about, counselor. I just record the proceedings. She glanced around to ensure no one was listening. But if I were to offer advice, I'd suggest you prepare for every possibility with this verdict. Judge Blackwell doesn't forget challenges to his authority, even when he appears to concede. Curtis nodded, understanding her meaning. I'll be ready. As Curtis packed up his materials, DeAndre looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. Do you think we have a chance? Curtis considered the question carefully. The evidence against DeAndre was weak, and the defense had presented a compelling case. But he also knew that juries were unpredictable, and Judge Blackwell's bias had been evident throughout the trial. We've given them reasonable doubt, Curtis said finally. That's all the law requires. Now we wait. Curtis left the courthouse into the fading afternoon light, his mind racing with everything that had transpired. He had stood up to Judge Blackwell and, somehow, had not been completely crushed. But Loretta's warning lingered in his thoughts. This wasn't over. His phone rang, Grandma May checking in on him. As he answered and began to recount the day's events, he found himself walking past a small group of the black law students who had been watching the trial. One of them called out to him, Mr. Thornton. Excuse me, sir. Curtis paused, covering the phone. Yes. The young woman looked at him with undisguised admiration. We just wanted to say, what you did in there. It meant a lot to see that. To see someone who looks like us standing up to Judge Blackwell. Her words hit Curtis with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on DeAndre's case that he hadn't fully considered the broader impact of his actions, what it might mean for these students to witness a young black attorney refusing to be intimidated in a system designed to do exactly that. Thank you, he said, genuinely moved. But remember, it's not about defiance for its own sake. It's about doing right by your client, every time, no matter who's on the bench. They nodded earnestly, and Curtis felt a strange mixture of pride and humility as he continued his walk home. On the phone, his grandmother listened as he described the confrontation in chambers. You did what was right, she said simply when he'd finished. But be careful, Curtis. Men like that judge, men who've held power their whole lives, they don't forget when someone stands up to them. They don't forgive it either. I know, Grandma, Curtis replied, watching the sun setting over the city skyline. I know. The jury deliberated until late evening before being sequestered for the night. Curtis barely slept, reviewing every moment of the trial in his mind, questioning his decisions, preparing for the verdict. By morning, dark circles shadowed his eyes, but his resolve remained unshaken. When he arrived at the courthouse, a text message was waiting on his phone. Jury's back. Verdict in 30 minutes. Curtis took a deep breath and headed inside, ready to face whatever came next. The atmosphere in Courtroom 305 was electric as Curtis took his seat beside DeAndre. The young defendant's hands trembled slightly as he straightened his borrowed tie. In the gallery behind them, every seat was filled. Courthouse staff, law students, and even a few local reporters had gathered to witness the verdict in a case that had unexpectedly become something of a sensation. Whatever happens, Curtis said softly to his client, remember that this isn't the end. If we need to appeal, we will. DeAndre nodded but couldn't speak, his eyes fixed on the empty jury box. Curtis felt a presence behind him and turned to find his grandmother easing into a seat in the front row of the gallery. Dressed in her Sunday best, a powder blue suit and matching hat, Grandma May nodded to him with quiet confidence. All rise, called the bailiff as Judge Blackwell entered, his face a mask of judicial impassivity. The judge took his seat and gestured for everyone to be seated. I understand the jury has reached a verdict, he stated, his eyes sweeping over the packed courtroom before landing, briefly but unmistakably, on Curtis. Yes, Your Honor, confirmed the bailiff. Bring them in. The side door opened, and the 12 jurors filed in silently. Curtis studied their faces, searching for any hint of their decision, but they were carefully avoiding eye contact with both the prosecution and defense tables. As the jurors settled into their seats, Curtis felt a strange calm descend over him. He had done everything possible. He had refused to be intimidated. He had fought for DeAndre with every legal tool at his disposal. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same determination that had brought him to this moment. Members of the jury, have you reached a unanimous verdict? Judge Blackwell inquired. The forewoman, a middle-aged kindergarten teacher with kind eyes, stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? On the charge of armed robbery in the first degree, we find the defendant, DeAndre Lewis. The woman paused, and Curtis could hear DeAndre's breath catch. Not guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a smattering of applause that Judge Blackwell immediately silenced with his gavel. Order, he commanded, his face tightening with barely concealed displeasure. This is a court of law, not a sporting event. But his reprimand couldn't diminish the moment. DeAndre turned to Curtis, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. Curtis squeezed his shoulder in response, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm his professional composure. After confirming the verdict was indeed unanimous, Judge Blackwell addressed the defendant. Mr. Lewis, you have been found not guilty by a jury of your peers. You are free to go. His tone was cold, mechanical, lacking any of the warmth judges sometimes offered to exonerated defendants. Then he turned his attention to the attorneys. Counselors approached the bench. Curtis and Ada Pearson stood before the judge, who activated the white noise machine once more. Ms. Pearson, a disappointing outcome for the Commonwealth. Judge Blackwell began, his displeasure evident. Perhaps in the future, your office will be more thorough in its investigation before bringing charges. The prosecutor accepted the criticism with a tight nod. Yes, Your Honor. Then Judge Blackwell's attention shifted to Curtis, his eyes hard as flint. Mr. Thornton, while I congratulate your client on his acquittal, I feel compelled to note for the record that your conduct during these proceedings bordered on contempt several times. Curtis maintained his professional demeanor. I apologize if my zealous defense was perceived that way, Your Honor. That was never my intention. Indeed. Judge Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. You've won today, counselor. Enjoy it. But a word of advice. Courts have long memories. Attorneys who cannot maintain proper judicial decorum regardless of their personal feelings often find their effectiveness limited in the long run. The threat was thinly veiled, but Curtis refused to be baited. I appreciate Your Honor's concern for my professional development. Something flickered in Judge Blackwell's expression, perhaps surprise at Curtis's restraint or irritation at being denied the confrontation he seemed to want. We're adjourned, he said curtly, rising from the bench without another word. As the judge departed, the courtroom erupted in conversation. DeAndre was embraced by his tearful mother, who had attended every day of the trial. Curtis found himself surrounded by well-wishers, the law students who had been watching the case, several fellow public defenders, and even a court clerk who whispered, "Well done," as she passed by. Loretta Washington approached with a smile. "Congratulations, counselor. I couldn't have done it without your help," Curtis replied quietly. Loretta shook her head. "You did this yourself. All I did was point you in the right direction." She glanced toward the door through which Judge Blackwell had exited. "He won't forget this, you know." "I know," Curtis acknowledged. "But neither will DeAndre. Or those students. Or me." Loretta nodded approvingly. "That's the right perspective. Now go celebrate. You've earned it." As the courtroom slowly emptied, Curtis was left with his grandmother, who embraced him tightly. "I am so proud of you," Grandma May whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Your parents would be too." Curtis felt the weight of those words, the culmination of years of sacrifice and determination. "I just did my job, Grandma." "No," she countered, pulling back to look him in the eyes. "You did more than your job. You showed that boy, and everyone in this courtroom, what justice looks like when someone cares enough to fight for it." Later that evening, as Curtis sat on his small apartment balcony watching the city lights flicker to life, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Judge Blackwell requested my reassignment to a different courtroom starting next week. Worth it, Loretta." Curtis stared at the message, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. Victory had come at a cost, not just to him, but to someone who had helped him. He typed back, "I'm sorry. Let me know if there's anything I can do." Her response came quickly. "Just keep doing what you did today. That's enough." Curtis leaned back in his chair, contemplating the future. Judge Blackwell's warning echoed in his mind. He had made a powerful enemy today, one who could potentially influence his career for years to come. But he had also stood his ground, remained true to his principles, and secured justice for his client. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Curtis knew he would face them without compromise. It was the path he had chosen long ago, standing on that sidewalk watching his cousin being wrongfully arrested, a path that had led him here and would continue to guide him forward. For years later, the federal courthouse gleamed in the morning sunlight, its imposing marble facade a symbol of the enduring power of American justice, both its promises and its limitations. Curtis Thornton climbed the wide steps with measured strides, nodding to the security officers who recognized him instantly. "Morning, Mr. Thornton," one called with a friendly wave. "Big day today, huh?" Curtis smiled. "Just another day fighting the good fight, Eddie." But it wasn't just another day, and they both knew it. Today marked the culmination of Curtis's most significant case to date, a class-action civil rights lawsuit challenging the discriminatory practices of the Metropolitan Police Department. After 3 grueling years of investigation, depositions, motions, and counter-motions, the parties had reached a landmark settlement that would fundamentally transform policing in the city. The case had transformed Curtis's career as well. He had left the public defender's office 2 years earlier to join the Montgomery Civil Rights Legal Foundation, where he now led a team of dedicated attorneys committed to systemic reform. His reputation had grown beyond the local legal community. National media had covered the police department case extensively, and law schools had begun using his legal briefs as teaching tools. Yet Curtis remained grounded, committed to the values that had guided him from the beginning. He still lived in the same neighborhood, though he had moved to a slightly larger apartment that allowed him to host regular mentoring sessions for Black law students and young attorneys. Every Sunday, he still sat beside his grandmother in church, her pride in him undiminished by his growing acclaim. As Curtis entered the courthouse atrium, he spotted a familiar face, Judge Howard Blackwell, now in his 70s but still commanding, still intimidating to most attorneys who appeared before him. Their paths had crossed occasionally over the years, always with cold civility but underlying tension. Judge Blackwell had never forgiven Curtis for that long-ago trial, and Curtis had never forgotten the judge's attempts to undermine him. Curtis nodded politely as they passed each other. Judge Blackwell returned the gesture stiffly before continuing on his way, surrounded by several younger judges and attorneys who seemed to hang on his every word. Curtis allowed himself a small smile. Some things never changed. He made his way to the designated conference room where the settlement announcement would be made. Reporters were already assembling, setting up cameras, and checking microphones. Curtis greeted his team, 3 brilliant young attorneys who had worked tirelessly on the case, and the community organizers who had first brought the police misconduct patterns to their attention. "Ready?" asked Tiana Reynolds, his senior associate and right hand throughout the case. "As I'll ever be," Curtis replied, adjusting his tie. It was the same tie his grandmother had given him for his law school graduation, a small tradition he maintained for important court appearances. The room continued to fill as the appointed hour approached. Curtis noticed Judge Blackwell entering with several other federal judges and senior attorneys, presumably there to witness what many were calling a historic settlement. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Curtis noticed something unexpected in the older man's expression, not the usual disdain, but something closer to curiosity. At exactly 10 a.m., the doors closed, and the U.S. attorney approached the podium to begin the proceedings. Curtis listened attentively as she outlined the terms of the settlement: comprehensive reforms to hiring, training, discipline, and oversight, substantial damages for victims of documented misconduct, and a court-appointed monitor to ensure compliance for at least 5 years. When it was Curtis's turn to speak, he approached the podium with the quiet confidence that had become his trademark. He spoke not of victory or defeat, but of progress and commitment, the long road that had led to this moment and the longer road still ahead in the pursuit of equal justice. As the formal proceedings concluded and the room broke into smaller conversations, Curtis found himself approached by a senior aide to the governor. "Mr. Thornton," the woman said, extending her hand. I'm Jennifer Liu, special counsel to Governor Warner. Would you have a moment to speak privately? Curtis nodded, intrigued, and followed her to a quiet corner of the room. The governor has been following your work with great interest, Liu began, particularly this police reform settlement. It was a team effort, Curtis replied modestly, and the result of years of advocacy by the affected communities. Liu smiled. Your humility is noted, but your leadership was essential. Which brings me to the purpose of this conversation. She lowered her voice slightly. The governor would like to meet with you next week. Confidentially. May I ask what about? He prefers to discuss it directly. But I can tell you it involves a significant opportunity, one that would allow you to influence the course of justice in this country on a much larger scale. Curtis's mind raced with possibilities. A position in the Attorney General's office? A judicial nomination? But before he could inquire further, they were interrupted by a commotion near the podium. The U.S. Attorney had returned to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for a moment. We have an unexpected announcement. The room quieted as all eyes turned toward her. I've just received word from Washington that the President of the United States will be making a special announcement at noon today regarding the Supreme Court. While I don't have specific details, I'm told it concerns the nomination to fill Justice Ellison's seat following her retirement announcement last month. A buzz of excitement filled the room. Supreme Court nominations were always major news, and the retirement of Justice Ellison, a pioneering jurist and the most senior member of the court's progressive wing, had sparked intense speculation about her potential replacement. We'll have a live stream of the president's announcement here in 10 minutes, the U.S. Attorney concluded. As the room rearranged itself to view the large screen being set up, Curtis found himself standing near Judge Blackwell, who was engaged in animated conversation with several colleagues. It will be Richardson from the Ninth Circuit, one judge was saying confidently. The president promised to appoint another woman. I heard it might be Gonzalez from Texas, countered another. The administration needs to shore up support in the Latino community before the midterms. Judge Blackwell shook his head dismissively. It will be someone with impeccable credentials and centrist leanings, someone who can get through confirmation without a bloodbath. The president can't afford another partisan battle right now. Curtis listened with mild interest. Supreme Court politics seemed far removed from his daily work, though the court's decisions certainly affected the cases he pursued. He caught Judge Blackwell glancing at him with an unreadable expression before turning back to his colleagues. The screen flickered to life, showing the White House press room where reporters were assembling. Curtis checked his watch, realizing he should be preparing for his afternoon meeting with the settlement monitor. He was about to slip out quietly when Jennifer Liu appeared at his elbow. You might want to stay for this, she said with a cryptic smile. Before Curtis could question her meaning, the president appeared at the podium, flanked by senior administration officials. After brief preliminary remarks about Justice Ellison's distinguished career and the importance of the Supreme Court, the president cut to the announcement. After careful consideration and consultation with legal experts across the political spectrum, I am proud to nominate Curtis Thornton to serve as the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. The room erupted. Curtis froze, certain he had misheard. But on the screen, a photograph of him appeared beside the president, who continued speaking about Curtis's brilliant legal mind, unwavering commitment to constitutional principles, and unique perspective shaped by years of frontline experience in criminal and civil rights law. All around him, people turned in shock and surprise, staring at Curtis as the realization spread that the nominee was standing among them. Cameras swiveled in his direction. Reporters pushed forward. Curtis stood motionless, overwhelmed by a moment he had never anticipated, never even dreamed possible. Through the chaos, Curtis became aware of one particular reaction. Judge Howard Blackwell had gone completely pale, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like shame as he stared at the young attorney he had once tried to humiliate and derail. Their eyes met across the room, and for a suspended moment, the years collapsed between them. The young public defender standing firm against judicial intimidation and the privileged judge who had tried to put him in his place. But the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. If confirmed, Curtis would sit on the nation's highest court, his opinions and dissents studied by law students for generations to come. Someone pressed a phone into Curtis's hand. "The president is holding for you," a voice said urgently. As Curtis raised the phone to his ear, still in a state of shock, he caught a final glimpse of Judge Blackwell being escorted from the room. The older man's shoulders slumped in what might have been surrender, or perhaps, at long last, recognition. "Mr. President," Curtis managed to say, his voice steady despite the turmoil of emotions. As he listened to the president's words, Curtis's thoughts flew to his grandmother, to the young law students he mentored, to DeAndre Lewis, who had just completed his bachelor's degree, to his cousin Xavier, who had rebuilt his life after incarceration. He thought of Loretta Washington, who had retired the previous year but still sent him encouraging messages before big cases. This nomination wasn't just about him. It represented possibility for every child from neighborhoods like Ridgewood Heights, for every student who faced professors who doubted them, for every young attorney fighting uphill battles in hostile courtrooms. It was about transforming the very system that he had once viewed with such ambivalence from the inside out. "I am deeply honored, Mr. President," Curtis said finally, "and ready to serve." As he ended the call, the crowd around him erupted in applause and congratulations. Cameras flashed. Questions flew from all directions. But Curtis remained centered, grounded in the knowledge that the path that had brought him here, through hardship and doubt, through small victories and painful lessons, had prepared him for whatever challenges lay ahead. Supreme Court Justice Curtis Thornton. The courtroom had indeed gasped at the announcement, just as they had years ago when a young public defender had refused to be silenced by a judge who believed he didn't belong. Curtis straightened his shoulders and stepped forward to address the gathered press, ready to begin the next chapter of his journey toward justice, not just for himself, but for all those who would follow in his footsteps. The system that Judge Blackwell had once warned was bigger than any individual was about to change, one principled decision at a time. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Have you or someone you know ever witnessed being judged unfairly? Drop a comment below, share your story. Subscribe for more powerful stories of injustice, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.